Hey everyone! So, welcome to Wednesday night, the 8th of January 2020. Haven't started by saying the date before, so I guess that's just what we're gonna do. Yeah, the Iran thing. Um, I'm gonna try and just like slice through the whole Saturn and Pluto conjunction thing and give you guys some insight on how that matches with what's going on in Iran at the moment. Like you know, if you've looked at the previous videos, I've been focusing on this right now. There's so much that I've felt overwhelmed with. Probably even what I've put out there has been overwhelming to actually take in. I'm doing my best with that. My newest approach is going to be just to slice through on issues rather than pack it into just one particular conjunction. And even whilst I'm doing that, I'm noticing things happen like this Iran thing. Um, and I just want to slice through and just show exactly, um, like how that relates to the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which goes exact in a couple of days, right? But which has been building up all through the past year and will continue to have immediate effects into the next year. You know, if not for the fact that it's a huge conjunction. So really, with these planets, Saturn being the original boundary of the solar system, Pluto being, like the latest boundary of the solar system. So really looking at large scale boundaries and lengths of time, cycles and stuff, um, the effects that happen around these time, as you might have noticed, have been quite long lasting. So it's been a couple of minutes. I'm just going to get straight into it, and I reckon you guys are going to find this pretty interesting and a lot of information to be able to, easily take away in bite-sized packages and do your own research, which is the fun part. So, what's going on in the Middle East now, how this relates to Zionism, right? Now, Wiki Zionism, probably a lot of you have heard the term. The term didn't actually originally exist until after Jews started in mass formation of people immigrating to Palestine, right? It was coined by an Austrian Jew in 1890, yeah, at the time of what's called the First Aliyah. Now, an Aliyah is like a kind of, now correct me here because I'm assuming that it could also refer to a Jewish pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to Palestine. But traditionally, it's taken on the context of actually repatriating, right? So now Jews have lived in Palestine, throughout the time since the Romans, expelled the Jews in the first century, in basically the generation of Christ, right? Now they've continued to live there. Majority fled or were forcibly removed. There has been a smaller population who ostensibly and relatively lived quite quietly and fairly peacefully, even under Islamic rule in Palestine. I won't go into that, but I'm just making a point. It's not the first time that Jews were living in Palestine. But what happens, right, in around 1881, you have this huge persecution of the Jews that occurs in Russia, in the western parts of Russia. And at this time, we're talking like Russian Empire, so what we would today call Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, that sort of area that was under the Russian Empire. Now, there's an assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and the Jews are blamed. Yeah. Now, what happens is that there's just these massive rioting, this persecution of Jews. Like Jews being killed, bashed, tortured, run out of town, a whole lot of bad shit. it's where we actually get at this particular incident, which went on for years, from like 1881 to 1884 or something, the word pogrom, which is a Russian word for, quote, to wreak havoc, to destroy, or to demolish violently, right? So pogrom, pogrom, if you're Russian, help me out. I don't know, Alex, if you read this. Yeah, like it's spread around the world as sort of in common parlance to describe, like an ethnic, persecution, coming close to or consisting of genocidal behavior, but specifically in relation to the Jews, because this was a huge one, right? Now, what happens is that as a result of that, 25 to 35,000 Jews actually flee and migrate to Palestine. It's only a small number, actually around 2.5 million Jews actually migrate all around the world. So we're talking about, like into Europe, into the United States, through New York, all of those pictures of Jews, fleeing through Ellis Island in the late 1800s with the Statue of Liberty. These a lot are Jews from Eastern Europe, Western Russia, that are fleeing this huge persecution. But some of them go to Palestine, and it's around the time of the conjunction, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1883. Now, begins in 1881. 1882, Baron Edmund James Rothschild, from the French branch of the Rothschild family, actually starts bankrolling a lot of these Jewish refugees. So, like they're fairly poor, and not many of them end up actually staying during this first wave of migration to Palestine. But in order to try and help them settle there, Rothschild bankrolls the establishment of Jewish settlements in Palestine. He bankrolls the starting of Jewish businesses in Palestine. He bankrolls the starting of industry, even talking about brand new electrical power plants and stuff like this. Electricity as sort of a public access was only really coming into its own at that time. Rothschild starts bankrolling this stuff, right, into the Middle East. Now, that's in 1882, into the second year of this influx, right? The same year, there is a dude called Leon Pinsker, who on New Year's Day 1882, he starts distributing this pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, in which he begins presenting the idea that a Jewish state needs to be created. Now, that was never necessarily in Palestine. That was one of the ideas, but as you might have heard, many different suggestions. I think even in like Brazil or Argentina, different places in Africa were being proposed as a homeland for the Jews, so that they weren't, subject to all of this persecution that had gone on for centuries. But 1883 is when that really comes to a head. A guy called Isaac Rolfe, in 1883, which is the year of the exact conjunction, he takes it a step further and he insists that this Jewish homeland that needs to exist has to be in Palestine, and it has to have a national language of Hebrew, right? And this is like a revival of the Hebrew language that begins around this time as well. In like 1883, there's one particular rabbi that migrates to Palestine at the time and sets up one of the first yeshivas to revive the Hebrew language. Now, this is at the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, 1883. Yeah, there's an emphasis on buying up the land in Palestine. Now, I'm going to read some quotes, and I want to stress here as well. Like, I'm presenting facts. I'm not trying to take a side on either Arabs or Jews or anything like that. But I'm interested in presenting the facts. So first of all, you guys know there's a history of this. These persecutions were pretty fucking full on. And a lot of the reason that a lot of these Jews actually went to Palestine during this first and second Aliyah as well in the late 1800s and early 20th century is not necessarily because they were like really passionate Zionists. That had a lot to do with the pushing of it and Rothschild providing the money towards it. But a lot of them were just basically looking to save their lives, to live free of persecution. They're fleeing bad economic conditions in Eastern Europe, and as well this harsh persecution as well that was going on. So that was the major driver. But there were definite Zionist undertones, and the term Zionism came out of this first big push known as the First Aliyah. So I'm going to read some quotes from this time. Remember, the exact conjunction is in 1883. Now, these quotes are from instance, October 1882, from Vladimir Zeev-Dubno, one of the original settlers who wrote to his brother. This is one of the like main pioneering founders of the first settlements that got set up at this time as well, right? Like this is full on. So the ultimate goal is in time to take over the land of Israel and to restore to the Jews the political independence they have been deprived of for these 2,000 years. The Jews will yet arise and, arms in hand, if need be, declare that they are the masters of their ancient homeland. Then in the quote, I'm reading this from Wiki, you can look it up, it's on the First Aliyah Wikipedia article, it's got references there. Himself, he now actually shortly afterwards returned to Russia. Ben Yehuda, who settled in Jerusalem in September of 1881, wrote in July of 1882 to Peretz Smolenskin in Vienna, "The thing we must do now is to become as strong as we can, to conquer the country covertly, bit by bit. We will not set up committees so that the Arabs will know what we are after. We shall act like silent spies. We shall buy. These are all letters from 1882, right? Late 1882. Now, let's check this. In October of 1882, Ben Yehuda and Yehiel Michael Pines, who had arrived in Palestine in 1878, way before this Aliyah, as I was saying, you know, there were a few people who had lived there as well. Now, wrote to Rashi Pin in Vilna, "We have made it a rule not to say too much, except to those we trust. The goal is to revive our nation on its land. If only we succeed in increasing our numbers here until we are the majority," an emphasis placed in the original letter, "there are now only 500,000 Arabs who are not very strong, and from whom we shall easily take away the country, if only we do it through stratagems and without drawing upon us their hostility before we become the strong and the populous ones." So now, returning to this as well, it's at the time of this conjunction and of this first Aliyah that the first 28 Jewish settlements are set up in Palestine. I want to say this as well, that it's actually that, you know, look at the work of Hobsbawm. He's a really good writer on nationalism. Nationalism as we know it today, right, didn't really come into its own until the late 1800s, and this in itself is just sort of like the Jewish expression of this nationalistic desire. So, like we're going to see, the modern nation of Iran rises up through these similar time periods. Nationalism, Arab nationalism in the Middle East, starts to occur there. Moving on to the next point, because this is going to take way too long again. So, 15 minutes. Where's my... So, okay. So that's the first conjunction. Now, during 1882, when these letters are being written, Saturn is pushing closer and closer to Pluto. It stations retrograde early September 1882. Excuse me. Just 4 degrees out from Pluto. All the while, Pinsker's pamphlet is spreading, calling for this Jewish homeland, and Rothschild is bankrolling the settlements and businesses and industries of Jewish immigrants into Palestine. Yeah. Now, the first 4 of settlements in Palestine were established in 1882, further 3 in 1883, and by the time that the first wave was completed and gave way into the second wave, we've already got 28 settlements, 28 Jewish settlements in Palestine, right, by 1904. Moving on. Next, Saturn and Pluto conjunction occurs in early October of 1914. Now, within a month, we have Britain, meaning the British Empire, and its allies, including Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Britain declares war on the Ottoman Turkish Empire in early November of 1914, like within a month of the exact moment of this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Clearly, you know your basic history as well, like this is the very beginning of World War One, before anyone really realized how much of a fuck-up it was going to be, before stalemate and trench warfare really kicked in. Still early days. So, January 1915, we have this member of British Parliament called Herbert Samuel. He begins pushing for British conquest of Palestine and to establish a home for the Jews under the British Empire, with the intention, he sells it, of Britain controlling the Suez Canal. Yeah, so it has a political strategic control point in the Middle East. So Herbert Samuel is the first openly, nominally practicing Jew in British Parliament. Well, to hold, I think, the position of a leader of a major party, as he did later in the 1930s. But yeah, significant character. Really holding off on saying more there because there's interesting stuff before that. But yeah, anyway, pardon me. Quote, to attempt to realize the aspiration of a Jewish state 1 century too soon might throw back its actual realization for many centuries to come. Now that's in The Future of Palestine, which is a memorandum that he began distributing in January of 1915. Which was putting forth this proposal and sending it around to all members of the British Parliament, of the governing cabinet. We should conquer Palestine off the Turks, make this a priority, establish a Jewish homeland for the Jews, so that eventually they can have their own nation, but protect them under the rule of the British Empire first. And then Britain can have a foothold in the Middle East. So, this is just after Britain declares war on the Turks. This is around the time that he's pushing this, and this memorandum on the future of Palestine is going out. This actually coincides with the Gallipoli campaign. Like the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, right? So, yeah, some significant point in time. Herbert Samuel is then appointed the first High Commissioner to Palestine in 1920. Now, if you know the film The Lawrence of Arabia, um, check it out. Peter O'Toole, I think it is. Brilliant movie. It looks at this particular time period, right? It doesn't focus so much on Britain's efforts to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, but it does look at the complementary thing, which is Britain agrees that if the Arabs will help them fight against the Turks, that they will promise Arab nationalism, that the Arabs can have Arabia to themselves and have independence in an Arab nation, right? So that occurs right down here. So I'm writing. There's a series of letters that goes on between the Sharif of Mecca, anyway, and like the British High Commissioner for Egypt. They began exchanging at the time of this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. They saying, look, what do you reckon of this idea? This is the Sharif of Mecca, okay, and the Arab revolt or the Arab uprising, of which T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia, is one of the guys sent out to lead. And have you seen the film? He sort of he breaks the rules a bit, but he does this marvelous job, and he joins. Basically, he's a quite a refined British gentleman officer who really embraces and almost becomes an Arab, which was shocking to a whole lot of British at that time. But he really joins in and embraces the Arabic culture and leads them to this victory against the Turks. Leads with a whole lot of other Arabic leaders, of course. And this uprising begins in Mecca, and looking at these notes, right? So, yes. So it has to do with the British conquest of Palestine. The British captured Jerusalem as a result of this whole movement in December of 1917, and they send a letter to the Rothschild, Baron Walter Rothschild, in England, and it's called the Balfour Declaration, right? So they send this letter to him, and they say, "Look, we've captured Jerusalem. We're going to make a homeland for the Jews." Yeah, and that's Rothschild accepts this letter and this invitation on behalf of all the Jewish people. Now, indeed, this was followed with the final offensive in the Sinai and the Palestine campaign of World War One, September 1918. Now, this is an interesting point, right? Because Allenby, who's the field marshal leading this campaign, names the Battle of Megiddo. Now, not much fighting went on around the area of Megiddo, but it's recorded that he named it this because it has a biblical significance, a symbolic biblical significance, right? For them to be fighting this final campaign to open up Palestine, to create this Jewish homeland under the shelter of the British Empire in 1918, right? Now, what is the significance? Megiddo is where we get the word Armageddon. It's the prophecy of Armageddon, meaning like that final battle at the end of the age. Allenby literally chooses this because it's referring to, and it's the end of World War One. These guys about 100 years ago are looking at this, going, "Fuck!" For them, the First World War and the carnage and that it brought about would have seemed like the end of the world. So, just on a basic level, him naming it the Battle of Megiddo for propaganda, of course, also. There's a whole lot of British Israel connections there also. But I think the interesting point here is that it shows how a lot of the imperialist and Zionist movements, particularly coming from the backing of powerful Christian nations, has a lot to do with the connection of people with ancient biblical prophecy. And we can see this going on with the current situation in the Middle East today, with the Trump administration, with Trump voters. A lot of them are, revivalist, quote unquote fundamentalist Christians. I dispute that term in a lot of ways because, it's a misnomer in some ways. If you look at the fundamentals of the teachings of Christ, but I suppose that's just, at the moment, that's just sort of like picking at straws, small bones. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, Armageddon, right? They call this the Battle of Armageddon, and it's at the end of World War One. Comes out of this promising of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. So yeah, Arab nationalism. Now, when they appoint this Jewish member of parliament as the first High Commissioner, the Field Marshal Allenby, who'd led this campaign to liberate, they say, like to capture Jerusalem from the Turks, he said, look, to appoint a Jewish Zionist as the first British High Commissioner in Palestine, he said it's highly dangerous, quote unquote, highly dangerous. And he predicted massive violence, and he objected to it. Not only for just on those reasons, for obvious reasons of what the Arabs might think, but he actually pointed out that at the time they hadn't signed a formal peace treaty with the Turks, and therefore it was illegal under the Hague Convention and just under general military law for them to be appointing this High Commissioner, let alone a High Commissioner who was a Jew and a Zionist Jew at the same time, right? So yeah, Allenby sort of says, bad news, this is highly dangerous and there's going to be a lot of violence from it. But yeah, 1920, so 100 years ago, we're looking now, we're coming up to, the centenary of them appointing this High Commissioner, who was the guy at the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction who began really driving this campaign for Britain to conquer Palestine for the Jews in 1915. So yeah, this is very interesting. Same guy becomes the first High Commissioner of Palestine in 1920, 100 years ago. Keep that in mind. Now, yeah, like we said, October 1915 to January 1916, coming immediately out of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, we have the Sharif of Mecca with the British High Commissioner in Egypt agreeing that, right, the Arabs can have Arabia. Thank you very much. They are Arabs, and it is Arabia, but anyway, if they will rise up against the Turks. And this Arab revolt begins in Mecca in June 1916. And you get Lawrence of Arabia. So, okay, trying to make this as quick as possible. But these are all happening at the conjunction. Now, next conjunction that occurs, early August of 1947, is, of course, the partition of India and Pakistan. That happens in August of the conjunction. It's within a few days of the exact conjunction, right? So the birth of the modern nations of India and Pakistan, and sadly enough, along with the birth of both of these modern nations, concurrently you have the birth of the conflict. That's on the exact point of 1947, but what follows immediately in its footsteps is another partition, which is the Partition of Palestine, right? So let's go into that in 1947. So September 1947, it is proposed to partition Palestine into A, an Arab state, B, a Jewish state, and then Jerusalem as a special international regime, considering its kind of global significance to, members of, the main Semitic faiths of Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Not to mention a whole lot of other different peoples and cultures as well. So that was the original proposal. Jewish state, Arab state, and Jerusalem can be this special international zone, right? Signifying a whole new era. Now, most Jews accepted this, and most Arabs just straight out rejected it. They would not accept it. Now, it should also be noticed that it shouldn't be sort of painted like, oh, well, the Jews were being just completely nice and the Arabs were being the stubborn assholes with this. There's enough evidence to show that it clearly stated that this was a strategic decision on many of the Jewish people. The extreme Jewish nationalists who were killing the British at the time said no, they did not want to accept it. They wanted nothing else but complete kicking the Arabs out and complete dominance of Israel by the Jews. This is going on in 1947. There's this whole debate, the UN is appointed this committee of people from around the world to try and work it out, because what's been happening for the years up until this point is that Jewish terrorists are killing the British, right? Who have had this British mandate, which they've been saying, okay, we're going to provide a mandate for the Jewish people in Palestine, a home for them. Now, as with all of those mandates in First World War, they were only supposed to be temporary, and they were to, as soon as possible, yield actual independent nations for the peoples who were being ruled, right? So you look, for example, in 1945, you have the birth of the nations of Syria and Lebanon. Now, before that, from the First World War up until 1945, this was under the French. The French had this protectorate mandate over the areas of which today we know as Syria and Lebanon. Hence why a lot of Syrian and Lebanese people, particularly the old school, can speak French too, if you notice that. So, yeah, 1945, Syria and Lebanon had become independent nations, right? The French had moved out, and the Syria and Lebanon were admitted as sovereign nations to the United Nations. The Jews were still under the British. They were pissed off, right? Iraq, after the region and the Iraqi people, after the end of the First World War, they were under a mandate too, under British mandate. Now, by 1932, they had their independence as a sovereign nation, Iraq, right? Now, again, the Jews are watching this go on, and they're sort of like, well, okay, Britain, you've helped us out, can you fuck off now? And the British weren't in any hurry to go, so a whole lot of Jewish terrorists start rising up and brutally killing a whole lot of British officials and police officers and military officers and a whole lot. So that's the reason why by the time we get to 1947, Britain is like, okay, we're out of here. 103 British dead between 1945 to 1947. 391 had been wounded by Jewish terrorists. Yeah. So time it gets to June 1947, the British are like, look, whatever happens, we're getting out of here. We're not getting involved. Jews and Arabs can sort it out for themselves. So UK doesn't intervene. It just starts withdrawing. More and more tension happens. The partition proposal that is given to have a Jewish state and an Arab state and have Jerusalem as sort of like a shared international regime is rejected, and you have civil war implode in the country, and that leads into all-out war once Israel declares itself as an independent sovereign nation in 1948, and a whole lot of Arab nations from all around converged to attack it, to destroy it, right? Now, that is how the modern nation of Israel is born. Less than a year after the exact moment of this Saturn and Pluto conjunction in August of 1947. And yeah, like the partition and the debates surrounding that, and again Britain withdrawing. All of those things are to be noted, right? Last conjunction, it was Britain pushing forward with the Rothschilds to say, okay, we're going to create this this homeland for the Jews and use it for British strategy in the Middle East, right? For oil, right? And oil is a big thing at that time, and we're looking at the time where automobiles are really starting to be mass produced. You know, Henry Ford after World War One in the 1920s, like pumping out these, you know, Model T Ford, stuff like that. It's the start of the automobile age. There are cars at that time, but it becomes like the world of cars from that. And you know, not to mention all of the other uses for oil, right? So yeah, they want to dominate, and the French Rothschilds, going back to the previous one with the First Aliyah, it's the French Rothschilds who were bankrolling the first settlements and industry from 1881 onwards in Palestine. So we're looking at all of these Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, 1883, 1914, and 1947. As you can see, they're all involving, you know, like European sort of British French stratagem, the Rothschilds moving into the Middle East to control the resources, sort of like guiding and supporting nationalist uprises to sort of geopolitically shape the Middle East. And these are major points. They're not just, you know, oh well, you can pick a date and there it is. No, you know, this is the beginning of Zionism before Zionism was even a word. Yeah. And then you've got, you know, like the beginning of a Jewish homeland under the protection of the British Empire. And then you get actually the Jews by themselves rising up against the British Empire and pushing and forming their own independent sovereign nation state called Israel, right? These are all major significant points. They're not just any willy-nilly freaking thing. And they all happen like at the time of these Saturn and Pluto conjunctions. Man, is it hard to be able to get this all down. I might have to try and make a shorter video for this. Right, so yeah, moving on. November 1982 now. We're wrapping this up. November 1982, in the immediate aftermath of Iran's invasion of Iraq in Operation Ramadan. Now, let's go into this. November 1982 is the most recent Saturn and Pluto conjunction. Now, November 1982, as I've just said, is in the immediate aftermath of one of the most brutal battles in history. Iran tried to invade Iraq after the Islamic Revolution had happened in Iraq a couple of years earlier, 1979. Now, to back it up and go through that a little bit, Trump, with these most recent most recent strikes, when he was twittering all this stuff, he specifically, if you notice, he specifically mentioned, we have 52 places that we're ready to strike, one for each of the Americans that you took hostage, way back in 1979. He's referring to this crisis, yeah, which was the hostage crisis, U.S. Embassy hostage crisis in the wake of this Iranian Revolution. So, bit of background to this, and I'm going to refer to the notes as well. Okay, I just looked at the clock because I want to get going, and it's actually 9/11, and I thought, oh, don't mention it because I'm gonna sound like some nut job truther or something like that. Not no offense to like the whole um 9/11 or whatever. I reckon there's some interesting shit to do with that, but I'm also fairly skeptical about a whole lot of the truth and stuff, as I think most people should be. Um, but yeah, don't just write every single thing off because like conspiracies do exist. Um, anyway, that's another topic for another day. Um, yeah. Now this battle was actually the largest land invasion since World War One, and this Iranian and Iraqi war, um, it went on throughout the 80s. Like it didn't end until 1988. 500,000 people died. It A lot of it was trench warfare, right? Um, Chemical weapons like mustard gas and stuff like that, which were used in the First World War, was being used, and one of the defining characteristics of this war, and particularly this battle that happens, just immediately before the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1982, um, involved massive human wave attacks. So that old school kind of like fighting, in which, again, which is very typical of World War One and before it, where the leaders would just send up masses and masses of waves of people to just run against machine gun fire, with the hope of freaking out and overwhelming the enemy. Just absolutely brutal and old school, and a lot of the sort of Islamic extremism under the Ayatollah Khomeini, which really pushed and began this big martyrdom movement, like, die for Islam, die for Iran, die for the for Islamic Revolution, sending kids as young as like 12, 13, to go running against machine gun fire. Like a lot of people died, even in this particular battle alone, right? 7,500 Iraqis were killed or wounded. 20,000 Iranians were killed or wounded. And it didn't get Iran really anywhere at all in this particular battle. And then the war went on for like several more years after this, for like 6 more years. Brutal. So yeah, it was a massive fail. And bit of background of this: the Iranian Revolution, 1978 to 79, brings the Ayatollah Khomeini into the position of the supreme leader under a new theocratic republican constitution in December of 1979. And during this whole time, you have this Iranian hostage crisis, with these 52 Americans being held for 444 days in the Iranian embassy from November 1979 through to January of 1981. Right. Now, I'm gonna try and wrap this up because this is the last portion of it. The Charr of Iran. Now, why was this Islamic extremist revolution? Well, you had the U.S., basically the CIA and Britain, perform a coup when after World War II. Okay, like they promised the Iranian people an independent nation, and this occurred, right? And there was Iranian nationalism, and their very first prime minister decided he was going to nationalize the oil. Mossadegh is his name. Mossadegh, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Mohammad Mossadegh. He's the first prime minister of Iran. And yeah, unanimously, the Iranian parliament agrees to nationalize their oil resources, which at the time are controlled by Britain. Looking at these notes, right? So yeah, in 1941, Stalin and Churchill together had invaded Persia, had invaded Iran, to protect the oil fields from the Nazis, and they promised the Iranians, okay, when the war's over, you get your own country. After the war, 1951, Mossadegh nationalizes, with unanimous decision of the parliament and overwhelming support of the Iranian people in general, nationalizes the oil fields. And he says to Britain, look, I understand you're going to be pissed off, but hey, you can keep 25% of the profit. No British jobs are going to be lost. Okay, and what was that? Sorry. And we're not going to interfere with the whole distribution system that's set up by the big oil companies, right? Like, you can keep business as usual for all the big global oil companies. Britain, you get 25% of the profits that come out of this, and all of the British jobs are kept. Like, you can keep working here. We're not gonna fire people. Britain's like, no, fuck off. Give us your oil, right? Which they sort of are like, no, that's our oil. You can have your nation now, but we control the fucking oil, right? So Churchill, who's still prime minister at that time, he starts working with the CIA, and the CIA starts to organize a coup, and basically they organize to oust the first prime minister. They stop the nationalization of the oil fields. They return it to private British companies. And basically, the Americans take 40% of the oil, and the British take 40% of the oil. And they take the king, or like the Shah, who's basically like king emperor of Iran at that time, and they basically just firm him up and like make him a royal dictator to dominate the country. And be basically a US UK puppet for the next few decades. That's what happens. Now, this guy does a lot of the Shah of Iran. He does a lot of good things for the country. In fact, he brings in the vote for women. That pisses off a whole lot of the Islamic clerics. He modernizes the country in a whole lot of ways. He really, brings it into the modern age. But at the same time, being this US lackey, he also acts as their sort of like outpost during the Cold War, and like all of their monitoring surveillance, systems to monitor the USSR are there. And at the same time, the oppression under his regime is just fucking ridiculous. Like, you look at what Amnesty is saying all the way up until the 1970s about the regime under the Charr of Iran. It's great for like a lot of modern things, and for progress like women getting enfranchisement and having freedom from religious dogma and stuff like that. But political prisoners are in the hundreds of thousands. Like, there's a massive police state. Like, the king is monitoring every fucking thing that goes on. If you even are suspected of having some challenge to his way of doing things, you could be disappeared or locked up and tortured and stuff like that. And he's under the US thumb, right? So for a lot of the Iranian people, it's a win-lose situation, because they see it as well as quite embarrassing. Like, this guy starts to really get a big head. He crowns himself King of Kings in like the 60s. He has this massive, lush, huge global scale party. After he crowns himself as like, King of Kings, after the image, explicitly after the image of the ancient Persian emperors. He develops this whole sort of like godlike personality cult around himself, and yeah, like a lot of the Iranian people start to find that not just threatening and oppressive, but just outright embarrassing on a global scale. And by the time you get to 78, 79, they start to rise up against this regime. A whole lot of people, not just Islamic extremists, but the Islamic extremists end up dominating, right? And you get the Ayatollah Khomeini, and you get a government coming in which establishes a republic, but not a free, democratic secular republic. It's a theocracy, which basically is saying that, yeah, God rules this shit, Allah rules this shit, and the supreme leaders are gonna be the clerics, like the Islamic equivalent of the Islamic priesthood, yeah. So Khomeini is the supreme leader. To this day, the Ayatollah is the supreme leader. It's Khamenei now, not Khomeini, but also high Islamic cleric is the supreme leader of the state. Now you have prime ministers and all of that, of course. One of whom in 2000 said that they needed to wipe Israel off the map. Other things being said as well, that Israel is a cancer on the face of the earth. The original Khomeini, he called Israel the little Satan and used to refer to America as the big Satan. This is it's an interesting thing, because when the Charr of Iran was in power under as the U.S. lackey, shit was fairly peachy between Israel and Iran. And then once the Islamic Revolution happens, and they arrest all of these U.S. hostages, and they start railing against Israel and the United States, obviously shit just goes downhill from then. And from that day, there has been massive conflict between Iran and Israel, and this is playing out at the current moment, right? So yeah, let me see if I got any other notes here. Okay, so recapping. Oh, by the way, 25th of January 1980. So we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of that, which was Iran's first presidential election after the Islamic Revolution. Yeah. So the first president of Iran. They're in their seventh president now. This is just giving some context, right? Where basically Iran at the moment is coming up to the 40th anniversary of having its first presidential election. While all of this stuff is going on. Now, let's recap what I was saying, okay? So Saturn-Pluto Conjunction 1883. You have the French branch of the Rothschilds backing and bankrolling Zionist settlements in Israel. There's a connection to Russia as well, which is, you're going to see the connections between Russia and Iran and the Turkic peoples as well starting to play into this as we see this conflict develop. Iran used to be ruled by Turkic peoples. The Shah of Iran that we were just talking about, he is the son of the previous Shah, who himself was a brigadier general in a bunch of Cossack troops from the Qajar Turkic regime that went on since the 1700s, and which were dominated by the Russians, right? So Turkic peoples like Turkey, obviously, the Uzbekis, the Kazakhs, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, the Uyghur people that are suffering horrible persecution under the Chinese at the moment. These are all Turkic-speaking peoples. As you can tell from around this Central Europe kind of area as well. They dominated Iran for the greater part of the past few centuries, and in turn, they were really dominated by the Russian Empire. So Russia does have a sort of along with the Turkic peoples, and you can see as well Russia's backing up Turkey recently. And in Central Asia, all of these countries we've just mentioned were part of the Soviet Union. Russia's got a whole lot of chips stacked in this game. Yeah. So expect to see that come into it. Connection with 1883 is that the majority of the first huge wave of Jews came out because of the persecution happening in Russia, right? These pogroms occurring 1881 to 1884 is what pushes 25 to 35,000 Jews into Palestine, bankrolled by the Rothschilds. That's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction at that time. Next Saturn-Pluto conjunction, 1914, beginning of World War I. You have Herbert Samuel, this British parliamentarian that begins pushing within a couple of months of the exact conjunction date, pushing in the British Parliament, pushing throughout Britain. Britain needs to conquer Palestine for the Jewish people, create a homeland for the Jewish people under British protection, and we can have a great foothold in the Middle Eastern region, and particularly we can control the Suez Canal, right? That's the next point of the conjunction. 1947, what we have British troops withdrawing from Palestine and leaving it up for the Jews and the Arabs to fight it out, and out of which we get the birth of Israel, the modern nation of Israel. The Pluto-Saturn conjunction of 1947. 1982, we have the Iraq and Iran war, which is the biggest land battle since World War One. Much like World War One, in like the use of chemical weapons, for instance, and so like a repeat of what was going on at the last conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in 1914, right? A lot of these karmic cycles that are coming back. You can look into it. There's a lot. It's an openly acknowledged thing. There's a lot of freaky similarities between the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s and what was going on in like World War One in Europe. So at this time, what we're looking at is billions of dollars are given to Iraq to fight against the Iranians by the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and United Arab Emirates, which are all Sunni powers, to fight against the Shia. The 90% of the funds for weapons and for armory came from the Soviets, from the Chinese, and the French towards the Iraqis, right? Towards Saddam Hussein, specifically, to fight against Iran. The US provided the intelligence that basically oversaw all of the transfer of these funds and these weapons from other nations, but it kind of played both sides of the table here. The US negotiated the sale of biological and chemical weapons to the Iraqis to use against the Iranians, not only against the Iranians, but against the Kurds in their own territory. And when the UN started objecting to the use of chemical weapons against the Kurds and Iranians, and trying to pass resolutions to condemn it, the United States on several occasions went and blocked these resolutions from occurring, right? So that was what was going on in the 80s, right? And the first big push and massive battle of this kind of thing happens at this 1982 conjunction. Iran also created Hezbollah, right? Which is like literally the army of Allah, massive terrorist group to be able to fight in Lebanon, right? Like to uprise in Lebanon, and they also make attacks on Israelis and stuff like that. So yeah, this is around that time, and what comes out of it is like Yasser Arafat rising up, the founding of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, the first Intifada that comes up during this Iraq-Iran conflict. Like all of this is going on, yeah, and this is at the most recent conjunction. So coming full circle, I don't even know how many people are still with me on this. But I guess I'm not gonna really spend too much time on editing it. Wrapping it all up, like I was saying, I'm just giving some background to this, right? So we're up for this next conjunction now. As you can tell, there are significant points that have occurred at the time of these conjunctions in regards to Zionism, in regards to European imperialism. Now, meaning European, US, and UK imperialism in the Middle East, specifically to do with oil. Uh, like it's blatantly acknowledged. It's not disputed fact that there was a CIA-backed coup to overthrow the first democratically elected president of Iran in 1953, right? Because he nationalized the oil. There's no secret about that. Like, the documents themselves from the CIA have been out there for ages. It's an acknowledged fact. The main thing was definitely the oil. A lot of the time, what is argued is that, well, look, it was the Cold War. The US thought that by nationalizing the oil, it was kind of a communist thing to do, and therefore they were going to give out and they'd be allies with the Soviet Union in the end. So, you had to stop that and overthrow him, establish, this really strong kind of like dictatorial authoritarian monarchy that could be used as a US puppet. So like this is the background, the immediate background of why Iran is the way that it is today. It comes immediately out of the first few years after World War II, in which the Iranians were promised an independent nation, democracy. They got it. They used the democracy to say, okay, we're going to take control of our own oil fields to help with our own, determination of our own future as a people. And the British were like, fuck no, and called in the CIA to squash democracy there. That's what goes on, right? Again, centering around a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So a few things to be able to link in with it that's going to get esoteric now. And I guess I'll hope to try and end around the 108 mark, because that's also a good esoteric number. That means that is not, I'm not flashing that as some kind of fucking alt-right thing, alright? Don't do that. Yeah. So, pressed stop again by mistake. I'm wrapping it up. This is like the last bit of it. Sort of give some idea. Now, the last conjunction was also the time when Voyager went past Saturn and began to really send through some really close-up pics in 1981 of the planet Saturn, right? Which is really close to this last conjunction. Saturn occultly is the planet of the mind. It is in line with the third ray. If you look into that, which is really talking about the sort of creative aspect of deity, a lot to do with gaming, for instance, with strategy, with mathematics, with materialism, with form, and with the mind per se. It's the creator of thought forms. Now, being with the third ray, it has a lot to do with the third wave of most recent civilization, which occultly is known to be the Arab and Semitic wave of civilization, right? And to do with the Persians, the Iranians as well. Yeah. So it's interesting that Saturn is connected with the Arabs, is connected with the Persians, with Semitic people in general, and then specifically even more so for the Jewish people, right? Because Saturn in many different contexts is known, not just occultly but just traditionally and culturally, is known as the planet of the Jews. Yeah. Saturn associated with the six-pointed star, the Star of David. is one of the most obvious connections. Now, occultly going into this again, the third ray and Saturn as well, being of the main planet of the third ray, is connected with the third chain of our current Earth scheme, which is the third chain of incarnations of our planetary logos, occultly, right? Now, the moon chain is what it's called, and there is quite some connection with the third ray, with the Jews, with Saturn, with what's known also as the previous solar system, which vibrated along the energy of the third ray, which is connected with occultly in the Western occult tradition. We would refer to it as the Holy Spirit aspect of deity. In the Eastern tradition, you would refer to it occultly as the Brahma aspect of the Trimurti. So yeah, like connection with this kind of thing, and I don't want to let anyone down the garden path here, because this shit gets sort of crazy. There's a lot of stuff in there's stuff that I agree with David Icke, and then there's a whole lot of stuff that I just think like the guy's kindly I'm saying this, like the guy's sort of like slightly deluded, right, to some great extent. But there's a lot of stuff that vibes in, and there's a lot of truth to it, the stuff that he talks about. But yeah, I just sort of want to give a caution, because some of this shit really sends people down the rabbit hole, and there's a lot of crazy and sort of like nasty places that it can get to, right? Particularly as you'd imagine when talking about Semitic peoples and the Arabs and the Jews in general. Yeah. So now there is this traditional, well acknowledged connection between Saturn and the Jews. Some of you might have thought about the moon, right? And this whole conspiracy theory that the moon is actually an artificial construction, and it's used as a kind of like a transmitting station from Saturn to be able to beam the consciousness matrix that we're all being entrapped in here on planet Earth. And like in a lot of this, not just David Icke, but a lot of people around the same circles, they point out a connection with the black cube. Now, the cube and a black cube, particularly black stones, have a connection with Saturn in many different ancient cultures. And again, the number 6 having the connection. You have Mercury, you have Venus, you have the Earth, you have Mars, you have Jupiter, and then you have Saturn, the 6th in line from the sun, right? The 6th planet. So 6 is a number for Saturn, 6-pointed star, star of the Jews on the name, on the flag of Israel itself, and the 6-sided Platonic solid, which is the cube, which is also connection with the earth element. Again, the third ray is all about solidification, about essential form, material, the material aspect of God in matter. Yeah, God immanent in matter. You can follow on connections to do with marketing and materialism, to do with money generally, and you can start to see why that this can become a sort of like dangerous thing when people start to get fucking sort of anti-Semitic and shit like that with, right? But there's a connection there. I'm not going to go into all of this now because this video is way too long. Like I said, I'm just going to I'm trying to wrap it up with some connections, some occult connections here. But I really just provided you with some basic historical occurrences to give you a back up as we get into this exact moment of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and what's going on with the UK US in the Middle East with Israel and Iran right now, because shit's getting heated. So yeah, we're looking at main themes to really try and bring this all back together. These conjunctions have shown, looking at it just from this slice, from this aspect, major turning points in the growth of Zionist Israel, of the Zionist Israeli nation state. Yeah, we've seen that. I hope that's clear enough. Now, also to do with European imperialism in the Middle East tends to take major shifting points at these Saturn-Pluto conjunctions at the same time, involving the growth of the modern Israeli Zionist state. Now, when I say European, I mean European as well as US and UK imperialism, and I'm talking about as well connections very much connected with the oil industry and securing oil resources, right? Now, also looking at the fact that under the Charr of Iran, who was this US puppet, the relations were pretty solid with Israel. At the last conjunction, there's some interesting things to consider, that even while the Khomeini was railing against Israel and saying that Israel is the little Satan, it's the enemy of Islam, that, it's the little Satan to the big Satan of the US, right from the start of the Islamic Revolution, what Israel actually does in the Iraq-Iran war, while a whole lot of other people are basically piling all of their money and their resources to back Iraq and to back Saddam Hussein fight the Ayatollah, Israel actually pumps in like $500 million of weapons into Iran, right? And looking at this, I immediately question, like, a lot of people, like, what's to do with that? Like, they're straight up supporting their enemy. Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all, it wanted to make sure it still had a good relationship with Iran, so that it had into the future, even though they were not on really good terms at all. So it wanted to sort of go, hey, well, we can be your ally as well. Obvious fact is that it made a lot of fucking money for the Israeli arms industry. And as well, there is evidence down there, which you can look up. The references are in Wikipedia, and you can follow on from there as well with more references to evidence that Reagan had actually advised that he wanted the conflict to stretch out longer, and hence the U.S. arms, which are all American arms, which were pumped into Israel. He oversaw Israel pumping them into Iran to sort of draw out this conflict, to sort of, destabilize the Middle East, morally weaken and, weaken the morale in the Islamic extremist New Republic. They wanted to draw out this war, right? And for a lot of deeper reasons, which I don't completely understand it, but that's apparently what happened. So, yeah, some deep state shit going on at the most recent Saturn and Pluto conjunction. And, some, like, crazy, like, almost anachronistic re-emergence of, like, the ghosts of World War One coming back into, this fight between Iraqis under Hussein and Iranians under the Khomeini, which dominated the main part of the 1980s, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it up there, because it's been like about an hour. It's been a pretty rough video. Leave some comments, give me some feedback. I'm just actually trying to get this out. I'm probably gonna edit it and try and make another one, but whatever. I'll just put it out there just because this shit is hitting the fan. And if you've got the time for it and you enjoyed this, follow it up. Thanks for listening, and shalom, salam, peace, and light, love, and power. Jamar.